Welcome to this Florida Historical Quarterly podcast. My name is Daniel Murphy, and I am Assistant Editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. If you are new to these podcasts, please visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, where you can now access abstracts of each article in the current issue of the journal. Today's podcast features conversations with Dr. David Jackson Jr. and Dr. Tina Bucuvalas, who were both interviewed at the 2012 Florida Historical Society annual meeting in Tampa, Florida. In the first interview, Dr. Jackson talked with Dr. Robert Casanello, FHQ podcast editor, about Jackson's article titled Industrious, Thrifty and Ambitious, Jacksonville's African-American Business People During the Jim Crow Era, which appeared in the spring 2012 edition of the journal. In the second interview, Dr. Bucuvalas and I discussed the talk she presented at the meeting as the 2012 Jillian Prescott Memorial Lecturer.
David, thank you for joining us. Could you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes, first of all, thanks for having me, Robert, and it's my pleasure to sit here and talk to you about this research that I'm working on. My name is David Jackson, and I'm a professor of history at Florida A&M University. I also serve as chairman of the Department of History, Political Science, Public Administration, Geography, and African American Studies at Florida A&M University.
Now, I know you've published a lot on the African American experience during the Progressive Era.
Yes.
So in this article, you're really looking at black professional life in Jacksonville during that same time.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about how you got interested in that?
Yes, actually, I published a book on Booker T. Washington's tours throughout the South, and one of the chapters featured his tour through Florida in 1912. And as Washington traveled through various cities in the state of Florida, starting over in Pensacola and moving throughout the state, he culminated his tour with a stop in Jacksonville. And it was during my examination of his stop in Jacksonville that I became intrigued with the business success that was demonstrated and showed to Booker T. Washington while he was over in Jacksonville. And I started to research a little bit further the business success. Of course, during that particular era, Ocala was known for its black business class, and Jacksonville rivaled, if not superseded, Ocala in terms of the progressiveness of the black business class there. So that's how I really started the research on African American businessmen and women in Jacksonville.
So who are the people you focused on in the article?
Well, what I did is I decided to look at African Americans of different stripes in terms of the professional class. So I looked at African American attorneys, medical doctors, but also black businessmen who were in the insurance business, some who were in open department stores, banks, and so forth. So I kind of look at a wide swath of African American business people in Jacksonville, and some of those people include Abraham Lincoln Lewis, who was one of the founders of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company, Eartha M.M. White, who was involved in real estate, Charlotte Anderson, who was also involved in real estate in Jacksonville, and two of her sons, Charles Anderson and Richard Anderson. Charles Anderson founded the Anderson Oyster and Fish Company. He was considered to be one of the largest African-American seafood dealers in the country. And her son, Richard Anderson, he operated a department store that was in existence for over 60 years. But the mother actually was engaged in real estate. When her husband passed, she got into the real estate business, and she rented out about 40 homes in Jacksonville, and she later married A.L. Lewis's father. And so A.L. Lewis, of course, is one of the first African-American millionaires in the state of Florida. Some of the attorneys that I look at, John Mitchell, and I certainly feature Samuel McGill, who was a very prominent black attorney who argued cases before the Florida Supreme Court and was very successful in doing so. I also examined some of the early black physicians. The first one in Jacksonville, Dr. Alexander Darnes, would actually lay the foundation for a number of other African-American physicians who would come behind him. So really the article, the premise of my work in this case is that a lot of work has been written on African-American working class individuals. A lot of times we see and read about the vicissitudes of those individuals in terms of the struggles in their daily lives, but not as much work has been done on the black professional class and how they contributed to the advancement of civil rights and the black race during that particular era.
So now what institutions were important that they might have spawned for black life?
Well, I mean, certainly I mentioned the Afro-American Life Insurance Company because, during that particular era, a lot of these black business people are creating parallel institutions for African Americans, because in the absence of those institutions, African Americans would not have alternatives for those services. So there was a widely held belief that African Americans were great insurance risks because of where they lived. White insurance companies were discouraged from providing them with insurance policies. And, A.L. Lewis would come along with a number of other people. He was not alone, but they established the Afro-American Life Insurance Company, which would be a great benefit to African Americans in Jacksonville, but also throughout the country, because it did provide for African Americans this alternative in terms of providing the services. I think that on a smaller scale, where you have department stores like the one owned by Richard Anderson, that was so important because African Americans, when they went to white department stores, were not allowed to try on clothes that they wanted to purchase. If an African American woman, for example, wanted to purchase a hat from a white department store, she would either have to let the white clerk try the hat on and see how it looked on that person, or she would have to purchase the hat without being able to try it on and see how it actually fit first. So for African Americans to have this kind of alternative where they could go to these black establishments, it made a significant difference in their lives.
And you mentioned that this was all part, or at least within the context of a civil rights agenda. So how did the black professionals relate to the civil rights movement as a social movement?
Well, what we see is that I think that some of the earlier scholarship would connect the civil rights movement, of course, to the 1950s and some of the things that were taking place, but I certainly maintain that the foundation for those movements began much earlier. And so these professional people are members of the NAACP. People like Samuel McGill was, in fact, an attorney who worked on behalf of the NAACP in Florida. A number of these individuals that I feature in this article would join that particular organization, but they also helped to advance the cause of African Americans. So decades later, when the timing was better to advance some of these other aims, the community was better positioned to be able to assert themselves in those particular endeavors.
So if any of our listeners travel through Jacksonville today, where could you point them to as far as the legacy of these people?
Well, I think one of the biggest remaining symbols would be the Masonic temple that the Masons constructed in Jacksonville. And one of the things during this era was for people to demonstrate during this Victorian era symbols of manhood. And so these larger constructions of homes, and particularly this type of building, was a demonstration of black progress and manhood. And that structure is still there today in Jacksonville, and it was used for a number of purposes. It was not just used for the work of the Masonic Lodge, the Prince Hall Masons in Florida. It was also used for recreation. They had space in there for that. They leased out space for the Anderson Bank. They were on the first floor of that building. They were able to host receptions, and it provided a number of uses for the African American community.
Well, Professor Jackson, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out to speak to us today.
Okay, well, thank you for having me.
Can you please introduce yourself for the audience?
Yes, I'm Tina Bucuvalas. I'm a folklorist, and I'm currently the Curator of Arts and Historical Resources for the City of Tarpon Springs.
Excellent. Well, the first question I have for you is, can you just, in general, summarize what folk life means?
I consider folk life traditional culture, which is culture that basically is learned outside of institutional means. In other words, not from books, but from family, friends, community, religion. All of that culture that may be passed along over time, or maybe horizontally if it's a generational kind of tradition, an age group kind of tradition. But informal culture, basically.
Okay, I just have a follow-up. You say horizontally? What do you mean by that?
I mean, as opposed to temporal. For instance, there are traditions that are passed along among children, maybe games or parody kind of rhymes and things that may not be shared they may not have learned from the older generation, but just from their peers. They may not last for very long, but they're still considered traditional culture, even though they're not passed along for generations and generations, because they are learned and practiced informally.
Okay. Well, in terms of Florida, are there any themes or characteristics that kind of characterize Florida folk life?
Well, Florida is so diverse. I know there's a sort of sense among some people, or I get this when I go to the Florida Folk Festival often, that Florida is all cracker or African American, but having jumped into Florida myself from another state and into Miami, I was immediately thrust into Cuban Florida. And there are so many different Floridas because there are so many different groups that have settled in Florida, whether they're ethnic groups or religious groups, whether they're from some other part of the country. There's some regional blendings in Florida that are very distinctive. So I think of Florida folk life as the traditional culture within all of those groups, but in many instances it's also been changed by the state itself, by either their contact with other people in Florida or by the environment. So that things that came here haven't necessarily remained the same. For instance, in terms of ranching culture, Florida ranching culture is very different than you would find out west. It's really a synthesis of British traditions that came down basically from the Carolinas south into Florida, and the Spanish traditions that initially went to the Caribbean were changed a little there and then changed again once they came to Florida. And those two traditions came together, to produce a pretty distinctive set of traits, such as using cow whips, using cow dogs, certain kinds of techniques when you're rescuing cattle from hammocks that you wouldn't find out west, things like that. And then there's regional blendings of cultures, like in St. Augustine, where a lot of the settlers were Minorcan, which is really Minorcan, Corsican, Italian, and Greek, and brought some of their traditions from the Mediterranean over here. Again, we're fishing in the Atlantic, so things gradually evolved and became different. So Florida folk life, it's almost everything.
Okay.
Maritime is very heavy, though, because water is really a big element in the Florida environment. More than the Sunshine State, I think a cultural geographer said this, it's almost the water state.
Well, tonight you're going to be giving the Prescott lecture at the FHS meeting. Can you summarize what you're going to talk about in this talk?
Since the theme of the conference is Tides of Change, Florida's diverse communities, I'm going to be giving a initial overview of some of the major communities that really have settled in Florida, from the Spanish to the Seminole, to African Americans, Caribbeans, Latinos, but I'm going to be supplementing it with slides, images of research that I've conducted or that other folklorists in Florida have conducted. Because really what we do is look at contemporary manifestations of traditional culture. We inform those with a knowledge of the past. As you and I were discussing earlier, it's really kind of an ethno-historical field. We need to look at the past in order to make sense of some of these manifestations of culture that occur right now. Both views are really necessary to understanding who Floridians are.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Okay.
Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in the state of Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at UCF. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast, and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. In recognition of the upcoming quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513, the FHQ will publish a series of 6 special issues, each devoted to examining Florida over the previous 5 centuries. Beginning in 2013, a special issue will be published each consecutive year, with 2 in 2016, that provides an overview of current interpretations and evaluation of historiographic trends relevant to the period being covered. We look forward to receiving your feedback on these special issues and other future FHQ volumes as well. Finally, we invite researchers to access back issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly on JSTOR and on Palm. Thank you for listening to this Florida Historical Quarterly podcast.